Welcome to Human Rights Education Now, a podcast series from Human Rights Educators USA. I'm your host, Bill Fernikes, a member of the National Steering Committee of HRE USA, a collaborative network to learn, teach, organize, advocate, and innovate for human rights education in the United States. This podcast aims to raise awareness about human rights education and invites listeners to engage with the worldwide movement to make human rights education a core focus of educational programs from preschool through higher education and in both non-formal and informal community educational settings. Today's program is a conversation with Sandy Sohcot, founder and director of The World as It Could Be, a human rights education organization based in Northern California. In this episode, Sandy discusses the origins of her commitment to human rights advocacy and education, the development of The World as It Could Be, the significance of using creative arts to engage young people in working for human rights, and examples of projects students have developed with her guidance. Well, I'm very pleased today to be speaking with Sandy Sohcot, and a good longtime friend in human rights education. How are you doing today, Sandy?
I'm well, thank you, Bill. I'm looking forward to this discussion with you.
So, Sandy, what initially inspired you to take an interest in human rights issues?
I think that I've actually always had an interest in what I guess I would come to call human rights issues. I think I was first inspired when I was, I think, in middle school, and I was in a social group that was part of our synagogue, and our rabbi, Robert Goldberg, he was very active in the civil rights marches in the South, and he gave us a whole presentation on his experience, and that actually was my first real inspiration for wanting to be part of something like that. I feel like that brought awareness to the struggles that were going on. I was probably about 12 or 13, not very old, but that really was the beginning of my awareness and wanting to be doing something in the community. I didn't have a term of human rights for that until much later. And I think it was probably around 1997, I helped organize a group called the Women's Leadership Alliance with a colleague of mine, where we brought together leaders of women's business organizations to identify issues in common and to advocate as a louder voice. And one of our presenters was Krishanti Damaraj, who you may know. She was involved in this group called Wild, and we did a retreat where she presented us with the human rights framework. And that is actually how I got the more formal understanding of the idea of this framework of human rights, to actually gain vocabulary for what I think was already part of my kind of psyche, but did not have the vocabulary for it.
So would it be fair to say that in your education, you had had no formal study of human rights?
No. I think I must have learned about the Universal Declaration in history, though I knew about it, but I did not have it presented in a way, as Krishanti helped explain, as this framework for how to be in the world and how to help be part of generating a world that reflected human rights.
Did your Jewish education contribute to your, for lack of a better term, your commitment to social justice?
I think so. I think that, I recently had to explain to my granddaughter, who's going through a kind of rite of passage as she goes, she'll be 13. It's not a formal bat mitzvah, it's more of just a more secular rite of passage, and asked me how I learned my values growing up. And I did explain that I felt like it was my household, we were not religious, but we were culturally Jewish. I went to Sunday school, but I think the idea of tikkun olam, which is to heal the world, was brought to my attention at a very young age. And I think that that kind of set of values and of caring for other people and doing what you can to help others was really part of my upbringing.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so you get involved with the women's leadership group in the late 90s, and then you have for lack of a better term, an inspirational meeting with Krishyanti Damaraj. How does that translate into the development of your organization?
Well, it's an interesting path. When I was involved with the Women's Leadership Alliance at that time, I was very involved in the small business community. I had my own consulting business, Sohcot Consulting. I was a president of, and then the past president at the time we formed Women's Leadership Alliance of NABO, National Association of Women Business Owners. So I was kind of in the entrepreneurial world, but in 2001, I was asked if I would consider running the Rex Foundation, which was the charitable organization started by the Grateful Dead. And so I made a big transition in 2001. I did maintain my Sohcot consulting practice. That was part of my arrangement with the Rex Foundation. But I took on this position and I had to reconfigure the Rex Foundation to be more public beyond the Grateful Dead world, because the Grateful Dead were no longer performing Rex benefits, and we had to raise our own money to make grants. And one of the challenges was explaining to the public why the Rex Foundation made grants in so many different arenas. We made grants like to help environment, to strengthen community, to certainly in education and certainly in the arts. But it could be in almost any area that we could make a grant and help people. Mm-hmm. And so I decided to explain this. I would pull in the human rights framework, and I wrote a newsletter because that was part of my job, was trying to get more communication with a broader public. Mm-hmm. And I called it Perspectives on Being Human. And it was to explain the human rights framework and to help explain why the Rex Foundation made grants in such a variety of areas of support. And that, in fact, we were furthering the idea of human rights. And I included in that the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. And then I wanted to do something to bring that, what was in the newsletter, to life, to further the work of the Rex Foundation. And I wanted to do something creative. I wanted to involve youth. And I wound up and I had support from a board member who was helping me with this. I went to the Mime Troupe Youth Theater Project, a grantee of ours, and said, would you help me dramatize the importance of human rights? And that is what really led to The World as It Could Be. It really happened kind of by accident. I wound up generating this collaboration between the Mime Troupe Youth Theater Project, Destiny Arts Center, an arts-based community group that helped teens deal with social justice issues using dance and martial arts, and then Youth Speaks, which uses spoken word with teens to deal with social justice issues. And I raised some money to give grants to these organizations, as well as a creative director. And they created an original production that we ended up calling The World as It Could Be, a Declaration of Human Rights. And that name came about because one of the adults reading the declaration said, wow, I didn't know this document even existed. And it basically spells out the world as it could be. And that experience, creating this production, we put it on for a group of nonprofits at the Presidio, where our office was. And then we put it on at Balboa High School the next day. And that is what motivated the beginnings of the world as it could be, because we learned nobody knew about the Declaration. The high school students didn't know, and they were supposed to be teaching it. None of the adults knew. And yet when everybody learned about it, they actually got really excited about this framework. And what contributed to that were the use of the arts to help the youth digest concepts because of the different ways of grasping the ideas. And then what we saw was that the arts were being cut from high school programs or public schools because of various reasons, and nobody knew about this document that was supposed to be taught. And so we worked with Balboa High School, where we put our presentation on, and another high school in the East Bay to pilot curriculum to look at teaching the UDHR in high school, where it's supposed to be taught, using the arts, and a culminating presentation, which gives kids kind of a rite of passage opportunity. And that's what started The World as It Could Be.
So, what is it about the creative arts that you feel is so powerful in addressing human rights understanding?
This is what is really such a profound understanding that I received, even watching the youth and the leaders from Destiny Arts, the Mime Troupe, Ellen Sebastian Chang, our creative director, working with the youth. Is the arts are a means of both grasping concepts as well as expressing ideas. In terms of grasping, Sarah Kroll from Destiny Arts would have the youth create poses with their bodies to demonstrate what justice looked like, or what community looked like. They're kind of dramatic tableaus. And so the kids actually had to figure out how to embody what an otherwise maybe dry concept would be. And in doing so, they could then begin to articulate what this meant to them. They did creative writings on which rights meant a lot to them and why. They were articulating other concepts like universal, like how do you write a poem about what universal means? And so they had to use a different part of their brain actually to take what they were learning and bring it into their system in a way that would allow them to grasp it in a more visceral, emotional way. And then the arts became a vehicle for them to express what they learned. And in our first production, we had singing, we had dance, spoken word, different vehicles for the youth to be able to project what they got out of what they learned. And we know, opera and Broadway shows, these arts are, when people go and see them, they connect with ideas in a more emotional way. And that's what was happening with the youth. They had a double benefit in that they were not only expressing their ideas, but then they were receiving an audience that was really appreciating what their ideas were and wanting to receive what those ideas were. So I think the arts play a vital role in a way of connecting in a more visceral and emotional way with concepts that could otherwise just be written on a piece of paper.
It brings me back to the movie with Richard Dreyfuss, Mr. Holland's Opus, where he gets let go and the vice principal says to him, well, I'm going to prioritize reading, writing, and arithmetic. And Richard Dreyfuss responds and says, well, that's fine, but they won't have anything to write about now that the arts are gone.
Right.
Which I think is a profound statement, actually.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, it is painful to me. I studied to be a teacher in college. I wanted to be a teacher since I was in second grade, and I studied it. I learned in my education how to use the arts in teaching, and it was always part of just my consciousness. But that's not. I think that the arts have been kind of the first to go. Perhaps they're considered a dangerous vehicle in helping people think a little differently. Don't have
Well,
to be.
it's not the case in other countries. In Japan, it's not the case. In other countries, the arts are considered to be integral. But given that that's the case, would you say that was one among a number of challenges you faced trying to get the program you have into the public schools?
Yes, I think that the biggest challenge is that so many people do not know about the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. It's a missing piece of fact. Uh, Using the arts to teach academic subjects is not part of a lot of teacher training, and a lot of teachers, because of the funding cuts in arts, actually didn't really know that from their own experience what having the arts as part of learning meant. So would put on 3-day institutes, and we started doing that in 2010. And once we had teachers and organizational leaders taking our training, and they were experiencing our curriculum, actually using the arts and learning about the Universal Declaration, it changed everything once they had this actual hands-on to understand it. But to just explain it, even to administrators who have no frame of reference for what you're talking about, makes it difficult because they're not really clear on why this is going to make a difference in their school. But if you come across people who can, I got to work with an assistant superintendent in San Francisco, who then became the superintendent of the Oakland schools, and he helped me meet teachers in a school to get the program in because he understood it. So if you find administrators and teachers who are willing to really open themselves up to what this is about, then you have a pathway open.
Yeah, my experience is that there are very few school administrators who have a broad view of the ideas that might be embodied in, let's say, the Amnesty International human rights friendly school agenda or what you're talking about. So there is a professional development component that's essential, it seems to me.
Yeah, I think interestingly, I sat on the Human Rights Commission from 2004 to 2008 in San Francisco. And it is where Tony Hill, he was the assistant superintendent of the public school system. And I had done some research on, as part of my Human Rights Commission committee work, we were looking at how are how are people in San Francisco experiencing human rights? And we had a series of statistics we were looking at, like access to health care, home ownership. And one of them was high school graduation rates. And we found across the city, across districts, regardless of the socioeconomic condition of that district, high school graduation rates among African American and Latino youth were well below average. And so we set about to do a public hearing on this, and we called it Examining This Issue as a Human Rights Issue. And we were 2 weeks out of the hearing, and the public school liaison for the mayor came to us and said, you have to change the name of your hearing. You cannot use human rights in it because people will think you're judging them and you're looking for violations. We changed the name of the hearing because we wanted to have the hearing, and it was very successful. But that's an example of a real obstacle to the terminology being something that seems to cause people to react negatively.
Yeah, the national conversation tends to be about civil rights. It rarely discusses human rights. I mean, I give Bernie Sanders credit for actually constantly using human rights in reference to healthcare. But until he did it, hardly anybody, I mean, Obama didn't do it.
Yeah.
So the real issue, I think, is this idea of changing the conversation, as you suggest. But I want to switch over to something else that you've been involved in, and that is the effort to try to link human rights education more integrally to social justice. Can you talk about that?
Yes, I think that what I've been learning, I've now been involved in the world as it could be for 17 years. I've been part of HRE USA. And what I've noticed, well, we do social media posts and a newsletter, and this was couple of years ago. We had a controversy here about a mural of George Washington at a high school that depicted Washington in not the most positive light. And but parents objected, and there was a big controversy about whether this mural should be taken down. And we did a post about it. We had actually an interview with one of the artists that created a mural at the school that was like a response to this. And he talked about the importance of the arts and using them as a. I've had a couple of occasions in my work over these last 17 years at The World as It Could Be, and then with Human Rights, HRUSA, and we had posted a few years ago about this. There was a controversy at George Washington High School in San Francisco, where a mural that had been done in the 30s depicting George Washington and showing him with slaves in the background and a Native American prone on the ground having been killed, which was depicting the darker side of George Washington, that he was a slaveholder and that he was part of genocide. And this had created quite a controversy, and it was subject to being taken down at the high school. And we wrote a newsletter about this, looking at things from different sides, and we included a video of an artist who had done a mural at Washington High School, an African American artist, and he was stating the importance of keeping the mural and using this as an educational tool. And we got a letter back from a person who is in the Human Rights Education School of USF, criticizing us for not understanding education and not understanding, social justice. And it was really kind of surprising to read her language that somehow we did not understand that. And then on another occasion, I was describing how the work of this organization really was doing great work in human rights. And then the response was, "Oh, no, we do social justice work. We don't do human rights work." And this perplexed me. And I feel that, especially in the current atmosphere that we're in, we need to have much greater collaboration among allies, where we share a common concern for promoting the rights of all people and having access to justice and dignity, that we really need to see how we're connected and find ways to have a collective voice to furthering these issues, rather than seeing ourselves as somehow in separate quadrants. And so I have felt it's very important to create language that really explains how these efforts are directly connected. And I was inspired at a workshop that actually HRE USA did. And at this moment, I'm going to have to get her name because it's like escaping me, this wonderful speaker on both social justice and human rights, who wound up, I asked the question, how do you explain your work as both a social justice advocate and human rights champion? And she said, I feel like human rights helps create the standards to which social justice work is aimed. And when you see a wrong that needs to be righted and you do something, that's social justice work. And so they're directly connected. And that helped motivate some of the work I've been doing in trying to carry that forward.
Yeah, I think it's similar to the scholarship on global citizenship, because if you look at that literature, you find that human rights is viewed as a foundation for the study of global citizenship. And I would say, similarly to what you pointed out, that you really can't understand social justice unless you understand the international framework of universality and human rights. Well, that sort of leads me into the next issue, though, and that is that as I mentioned in the questions I had sent you, Tip O'Neill once said, all politics are local." Well, would you agree or disagree that all human rights issues are local? And if so, how does human rights education relate to that?
I strongly believe in that. I think that I feel like human rights behaviors happen in our most immediate surroundings. It's how we treat each other at our own dining room table, to how we connect uh, in organizational work, how we carry out our efforts. And in part of our curriculum is we have, as I think our lesson plan 3, we have participants write a story about where they have seen human rights respected or where they have seen human rights disrespected, and either directly experienced it or witnessed it. And the point of that is to see that while we teach at the Universal Declaration, we teach the facts of it, where it came from and how it exists. But what we want is for people, whether they're young or the adults taking our institutes, to see how does this connect to their own immediate experience. And we feel like that is vital, because it's really hard to see how this applies even in your community and how you want to do something about it if you think this is something that only exists in other countries, or that it's something that other people have to take care of. And a lot of times when people have written out these stories, we've actually had some fairly deep emotional responses to them, where they gain an understanding that they did not have before, that the words on that document, the UDHR, really come to life when they realize how they're connected to their own immediate experience, both positively and negatively.
Can you give us some examples of that you've seen in the students' work?
And there are many examples. Let's see. Well, when in one of our institutes, well, I'll go to the most recent. I recently went over to Arroyo High School, which is located in San Lorenzo, an unincorporated area near Oakland, California. And we piloted our curriculum with them. We've been working with them since 2007. And this one teacher has in her junior class of developmental psychology for adolescents, she uses our curriculum. The kids learn about the UDHR. She uses some of our activities, and then they put on a town hall. And so the one I just recently watched, the theme that the students developed was called The Path to Light. And they had different soliloquies of describing situations of concern to them. One was kids driving and being stopped by police because of the color of their skin. Another was a young person fearful of describing their own realization of their gender identity. So they actually had a number of different situations that they were describing. And I asked them afterward, they described how this was all based on learning about the UDHR. But after I posed, I said, how did learning about the UDHR contribute to your getting to this point of the path to light? And two of the students articulated, they said, what we found was we had these issues we were worried about. When we saw and learned about the UDHR, we found a place for them. We realized where they belonged in terms of the aspirational side that needed to be addressed. And it gave us a grounding for doing something about them. I think that's actually.
Yeah, so I think though that's interesting. Let me bring up one issue that I know has been problematic in San Francisco, and that is homelessness. Have any of your your problem? No, I shouldn't say your problem, but have any of your students and initiatives that looked at that as a human rights issue?
Oh yeah, they have, and in fact, oh gosh, it was in 2018. I had the opportunity, and it was actually because of HRE USA. There was a program that won the Edmund, I'm blanking on his name, the award for
The Ed O'Brien Award.
Ed O'Brien Award. I'm so sorry. That the program that won, they were doing human rights education as part of, I'm like blanking out on every name that I need to give you, so you'll have to edit this accordingly. But in any case, they were having a summer institute on human rights education, and we were invited I was invited to bring 3 students to be participants in this. And so I brought 3 students from Arroyo High School with me to participate. And one of the things that, as part of this week-long training, was that the kids would learn how to lobby. And so one of the issues for our student was homelessness. We developed actually a presentation for the student to bring, and we presented to Dianne Feinstein's office. We went to their representatives. We went to Kamala Harris's office, and we went to their House Eric Swalwell's office, and they presented what they felt needed to be done. And I'd have to look up the exact outline, but they actually offered some strategies that could be taken up by legislators.
Well, that's great. I mean, that sort of builds on what I would consider to be a very powerful idea in the curriculum, which is an issues-based curriculum. And so I think that's very much in the mainstream of that. Thanks for listening to Human Rights Education Now. Our next episode concludes our conversation with Sandy Sohcot, founder of The World as It Could Be. You can find additional information about this podcast series at www.hreusa.org. Each episode is available on the HREUSA podcast page, Spotify, Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, Player FM, and Deezer. They will soon be available on YouTube and SoundCloud. You can also download each episode as an MP3 file. If you have questions or comments about this podcast, send them to Christy, that's KRISTI, at HREUSA.org. Our podcast team includes host and producer Bill Fernikes, executive producer Christy Redelius Palmer, editor Elizabeth Schwab, sound designer and project manager Sabrina Sanchez, communications and public outreach coordinator Jessica Terbruggen, and production coordinator Jasmine Chizu Gota. The Human Rights Education Now logo was designed by Kim Berering. Human Rights Education Now is a production of Human Rights Educators USA, a project of the Center for Transformative Action in Ithaca, New York.